A respected attorney, Janice Garrett, suffered public humiliation on the courthouse steps, her dignity stripped away for all to see. Officer Roger Carmichael, hiding behind a badge and cold authority, pushed boundaries that should never have been crossed, igniting outrage in all who witnessed his behavior. Yet fate had its own plan. Janice rose higher than anyone could imagine, returning not as a victim, but as a judge. Discover how this dramatic reversal delivered true justice, and why the final verdict will leave you breathless, because sometimes the outcome changes everything. The morning unfolded slowly over Boston, casting muted gold across the courthouse plaza. Janice Garrett tightened her grip on the handle of her worn briefcase as she approached, her heart racing beneath the polished surface of her appearance. Today was not just another court date. It was closing arguments in a case that had come to represent far more than legal precedent. It was about principle, about the line between power and justice, about visibility for everyone who saw themselves in her. She could feel the sense of expectation and strain pressing down on her shoulders as she navigated the last block, her reflection fleeting in shop windows as she passed. Every detail had weight: her neatly pressed blouse, the single strand of pearls at her throat, the small pin her grandmother had given her after she passed the bar. In gestures both large and small, Janice carried her history, her family's hopes, and the trust of clients who had learned, often painfully, how hard it was to be heard. She thought of the young man at the center of today's trial. She'd seen echoes of his fear in friends, brothers, and even in herself. Each injustice fought for in court was a promise kept. Outside the courthouse, a crowd was already gathering. Local news vans lined the curb. Protesters clutched signs, their faces tense, but hearts resolute. She recognized allies and opponents alike, all united by the gravity of what was about to transpire. Keeping her head high, Janice maneuvered through the onlookers, offering a polite nod here and there. The line of officers at the entrance seemed more rigid than usual. Their uniforms were spotless, their faces unreadable, but a tension simmered beneath the surface. Janice recognized Officer Roger Carmichael from previous appearances. He was a symbol of procedural order, never outwardly hostile, but known for his unwillingness to bend. As she approached, the crowd's noise faded, and it felt as if all attention was boiling down to this point. Janice presented her ID, her voice steady. "I'm counsel for the defense. Garrett, Janice." Carmichael's expression barely flickered. He held up a firm palm. "Step back." Her credentials hovered between them. "I have court in 5 minutes," she began, mindful of tone, the importance of calm, measured words. But Carmichael cut her off with a sharp, dismissive gesture. "Not today. Wait there." Janice's pulse spiked. "Sir, you're interfering with legal." Before she could finish, Carmichael's hand brushed her documents aside. The folders tumbled, scattering papers across the broad steps. For a split second, the world stilled. Camera shutters snapped, and a ripple of surprise ran through the onlookers. Janice dropped to one knee, collecting rulings and affidavits, the evidence of months' labor. She was aware of every set of eyes, the sympathetic, the skeptical, the disinterested. The noise around her seemed to blur into a white wave. It was not the first time Janice had tasted this brand of humiliation. She'd endured it as a law student, as an intern, as an associate. But the public nature of this moment made it different. This wasn't merely about her. This was a message, amplified. Know your place. She felt heat in her eyes, but she refused to let it spill over. Anger rose, hot and clear, but she channeled it into focus. From behind, someone whispered, "She's just doing her job. Let her in." Another voice, cold, muttered, "Rules are rules." Even as her heart hammered, Janice kept breathing in an even rhythm. She gathered the last of her documents, checked her hands for tremors, and stood up as tall as she could. Carmichael looked past her, the exchange already trivialized for him. Janice stepped over the threshold, silent but unwavering. The courthouse doors loomed ahead, heavy and dignified. Inside, the machinery of justice waited, the same system that could both betray and redeem. As she walked forward, every step was a conscious declaration. I am here. I belong. Her mind replayed the morning's events as she walked the marble corridor, the dull ache in her hands serving as a reminder of the encounter. The sense of shame and outrage threatened to overwhelm her, but Janice had learned to transform such pain into resolve. She thought of the countless women, black, brown, and otherwise, who endured these moments daily with far less support or recognition. She would carry their stories with her as she argued for justice, her voice steady, her will unbroken. By the time she entered the courtroom, Janice Garrett was more than ready to fight. Whatever the outcome, she knew the true battle had already begun on those cold courthouse steps, under the silent scrutiny of a city that still had much to learn. In the days that followed, Janice Garrett's world seemed to narrow and sharpen. The scene outside the courthouse became a symbol replayed across news cycles and conversation threads, a moment caught by a few raised phones, dissected in whispers, and debated on morning radio programs. Some viewed it as evidence of persistent bias, while others insisted it was nothing more than adherence to protocol. For Janice, the wound was private, yet its ache echoed through every corner of her life. Returning to her apartment in the South End each night, Janice felt the weight of invisible eyes upon her. She checked her email with caution. Where once she received messages of encouragement from clients and colleagues, she now found only terse updates, documents, or threads that grew cold. Invitations to social gatherings vanished. Her legal partners sent short, formal messages, hinting at concern for the firm's reputation amid unwanted publicity. In the small kitchen, her mother's voice trembled on voicemail, urging her to let things be, a plea rooted in worry, not doubt. Janice spent long hours reviewing her case notes, replaying the trial's testimony and the morning on the courthouse steps. She labored over her closing arguments, not only determined to clear her client, but also to prove something unspoken, that resolve mattered, even under scrutiny. During late nights in her office, she wrote and rewrote statements, searching for words that cut through the noise without losing their humanity. The world outside seemed to close in. Headlines speculated about the incident, rarely mentioning her name, but often using her likeness in anonymous silhouettes. An online forum spun rumors that contradicted the official record, and a local columnist suggested that those who questioned authority were simply stirring discord. Former friends avoided her gaze in the street. Once she noticed a neighbor turn away as she entered her building, his hands busy with nothing but a set of keys, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. And yet Janice could not ignore a quieter, deeper current pulling her forward. On the subway to work, she would sometimes catch a glance from a young woman standing nearby, one that lingered longer than politeness usually allowed. In the courthouse halls, a custodian paused at her door to offer a steady, unspoken nod. A law student in the library whispered, "Keep fighting," and hurried off, embarrassed by her own courage. Still, the pain lingered. She dreamt of the courthouse steps, the scattered papers, the blank faces, the sudden coldness of the stone beneath her hands. Anger flared whenever she relived the moment, but determination always followed. She let it shape her rather than define her. Officer Carmichael's presence lingered in her mind, too. She thought of how he had not seen her, not really, and how little such moments seemed to matter to those with badges and authority. She wondered about his story, if he ever questioned the impact of his actions, or if he simply filed each day away as routine. Janice chose not to hate him. She reserved that space instead for complacency, for the unseen structure that permitted such encounters to remain unchallenged. Days bled into weeks. The trial pressed forward. She found herself working harder than ever, not only to win, but to justify her very presence. Each new motion filed, each cross-examination delivered, became both a shield and a declaration. Janice was acutely aware that the jury was watching, as were the judge, the media, and all those who had ever wondered if someone like her had the right to set foot in that room. Even as exhaustion gnawed at her, she reminded herself she did not stand alone. In rare moments of respite, she walked the city's old streets, finding comfort in the quiet persistence of row houses, the living history carried by brick and cobblestone. The city might not remember every injustice, but it held space for those who refused to look away. Janice let herself imagine a future where stepping into the courthouse would not draw silence or suspicion, but respect. A day when she would be judged solely by her merit. Sleep often eluded her, replaced by restless hours spent watching dawn break through her window. Each sunrise brought the promise of another challenge, and with it, a measured hope that persistence signified progress. Janice resolved to persist, to rise day after day, no matter how heavy the cost. She had found in adversity a kind of clarity she had never sought, but could no longer surrender. And even as the world seemed intent on pushing her to the margins, she carved out her place, one determined step at a time. Years unfolded with quiet persistence, each one shaped by the memory of a morning that had left its mark on Janice Garrett's life. She grew into her role as an advocate, not from anger alone, but from unwavering conviction. Every trial, every difficult client, every long meeting with anxious families sharpened her understanding of what true justice meant. In those years, the city changed in small, sometimes invisible ways, and Janice strove to be part of its growth. Her days stretched from before sunrise to late into the night, filled with the churn of research, late-night strategy sessions, and quiet moments with the files that stacked ever higher in her home office. Janice became known for her commitment, the defendant who was vulnerable, the policy in need of reform, the law student seeking wisdom. She partnered with community leaders and spoke at forums for legal reform, her voice measured yet gently insistent. She crafted workshops for young attorneys, teaching them not only statutes but the real value of listening and persistence. The struggle, however, was ever present. For every setback, a case lost, a bill stalled, a victory diluted by compromise, she found the strength to continue. Sometimes the weight of expectation was a burden. The quiet email from a mother whose son had been overlooked by the system. The late-night call from an attorney seeking her advice after a heartbreaking trial. The exhaustion that built in small, steady increments. Yet each challenge reminded Janice of the promise she had made to herself and to all the silent observers who watched her journey with hope. Within the whirlwind of work, Janice also found moments of connection and growth. A friendship deepened with Karen Davis, a reporter who chronicled her cases with fairness and nuance. Another profound alliance arose with Paul Middleton, an activist who had once doubted the value of the courts but came to see in Janice a living example of what perseverance could achieve. These relationships brought comfort and renewed perspective, helping her weather seasons of frustration and doubt. The nomination to the judicial bench arrived almost unexpectedly. A letter, understated yet powerful, delivered on a Thursday morning. For Janice it was as much a test as an honor. She struggled to balance humility and pride, remembering both the obstacles overcome and the many people who had walked beside her. The process was rigorous. Teams examined her record, asked probing questions about motivation and judgment, and sometimes pressed her about moments she would rather forget. But Janice answered honestly, guided not by image, but by belief in her work and its purpose. Letters of support streamed in, from families she had represented, old professors, community leaders, and attorneys who had opposed her but respected her integrity. Even those who once questioned her readiness now spoke in favor of her appointment. Janice read these words on quiet evenings, feeling them become a tapestry of encouragement. The city, she realized, was not simply watching her, it was rooting for her. The weeks leading up to final confirmation combined anticipation and anxiety. The media speculated about her appointment, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. Her friends hosted small gatherings, their presence offering comfort. Her mother sent handwritten notes, reminders of faith and endurance. Janice leaned on these supports, recalling the darkest days after the courthouse incident, grateful now for the perseverance that had sustained her. On her first day as a judge, Janice walked to the courthouse alone, the city still wrapped in morning coolness. She wore the robes with pride, but also with reverence for the journey. Passing through the entrance, she paused at the stone steps, the site of her former pain. No crowd waited, but the memory was clear. Security staff nodded, their eyes reflecting the significance of her arrival. She smiled at them, recognizing in their acknowledgement a subtle shift. She was no longer the outsider struggling for entry, but a central figure welcomed at last. Inside, the courtroom filled with attorneys, observers, and a few students nervously clutching notebooks. Janice greeted each with warmth, her posture graceful, yet authoritative. In the gallery, Karen Davis tapped notes on her phone, signaling quiet solidarity, while Paul Middleton nodded with approval from the back row. Janice's path to the bench was deliberate, each step an echo of past determination. As she settled at the head of the room, Janice allowed herself a moment to recall the years that had led here, not just the pain and challenge, but every act of kindness, every lesson absorbed, every voice that had urged her forward. Her presence on the bench represented more than personal victory. It symbolized hope for those outside the halls, young attorneys, communities in need, and everyone who longed for justice built not only on law, but on empathy and courage. The court was called to order. Janice surveyed the courtroom, firm in her belief that her story was proof. Transformation is possible. Justice can be made real, and dignity restored, step by step, trial by trial, year by year. For a city that had sometimes lost faith, her journey was now part of its foundation, and with every decision she made, new possibilities surged forward. The city's silent promise became embodied in her presence, unshaken and resolved, casting a light for those who would follow. The day Janice Garrett presided over her first case as a federal judge dawned cool and crystalline. Sunlight caught in the courthouse windows, painting shifting mosaics on the marble floors within. She arrived before most, her steps echoing in empty halls, a ritual of arrival that helped her settle her nerves, gather her strength, and recall the years it took to reach this place. Her robe felt heavy with meaning, both shielding and exposing how much she carried inside. Janice entered her chambers quietly, breath slowing as she reviewed the case files laid out before her. The matter was serious, a civil suit involving charges of misconduct against a police officer, accused by a young black man named Eric Monroe of excessive force during a routine stop. The parallels were resonant and undeniable. A vulnerable citizen, an authority figure, the question of whose voice would be heard and whose truth would be recognized. Janice recognized the ache of responsibility settling in her chest, but she met it with steady composure. This was more than a legal proceeding. It was the crucible where hope might be restored, or dealt new injury. The courtroom filled quickly. Lawyers arranged their notes, spectators lined the pews, and several journalists, including her old friend Karen Davis, prepared to document whatever unfolded within these formal walls. Among the onlookers, Janice noticed the faces of those she had come to know through years of advocacy. Former clients, activists, students, and neighbors whose lives intersected with hers in fleeting, formative ways. Their presence was a silent chorus, each gaze a quiet reassurance that she did not stand alone. She watched as Eric Monroe was sworn in, his hand trembling, eyes cast low. His family sat nearby, holding hands tightly, his mother's lips moving in silent encouragement. Facing him, the officer remained composed but restless, his attorney's whispers the only sound marring the hush. Janice listened as arguments were presented. She asked searching questions, her tone respectful but precise, probing for truth beneath practiced rhetoric. At times her eyes met those of Eric's mother, in whose expression Janice saw her own mother's hopes and fears. Every detail mattered. She weighed evidence with care, recalling the countless hours she once spent on the other side of the bench, struggling to prove stories that others doubted. Outside, the city moved on with ordinary life, unaware of the reckoning unfolding inside. Yet in that chamber, time seemed to dilate. Janice felt the courtroom's fragile hope and simmering anxiety file itself into memory, the weight of justice balanced in trembling hands. As closing arguments concluded, silence fell like a shared breath. She adjourned for deliberation, drawing comfort from her years of hard-earned wisdom. Alone in her study, Janice reread every file, revisited each testimony. She recalled the closing moments of her own ordeal, years prior, and understood, perhaps more than anyone could, what was at stake. The law had to be humane, not merely precise, It had to serve those it governed, especially those who once stood in shadows. When she returned to the bench, the room was hushed and expectant. Janice spoke with her signature steadiness, outlining the facts, acknowledging the complexities, but making clear that every individual, regardless of uniform or circumstance, deserved respect and protection under the law. She cited precedent with calm assurance, then announced her judgment finding the officer responsible for undue force, upholding Eric Monroe's right to dignity and setting forth a path for restitution and reform. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a gentle wave of relief, and for some, tears rippled through the Monroe family. Applause was not permitted in the courtroom, but an unmistakable current of gratitude seemed to flow from every corner. Janice felt her own composure tremble, not from doubt, but from the overwhelming truth that the hardest-won justice is usually the quietest. A city's worth of weight seemed to lift, not as celebration, but as a promise renewed. Afterwards, as the courtroom emptied, Janice lingered, collecting her thoughts and breathing in the sanctity of a duty fulfilled. Outside, she found herself approached by a small group, a familiar custodian, the law student who had once whispered, "Keep fighting," and finally a young woman named Mika, whose quiet voice carried the kind of conviction Janice remembered from her own youth. "Ma'am," Mika began, her gaze unwavering, "you gave me hope for law, for a justice that welcomes people like me." Janice quietly thanked her, offering simple encouragement and a reminder, "Never stop believing your voice matters." They stood together on the courthouse steps, the morning stretching open around them, the building behind now a place not of exclusion, but of transformation. For the first time in years, Janice paused on those steps, looking out over the city with a heart both light and steadfast. She saw, through the rough veneer of daily life, countless stories waiting for another chance. The pain and struggle she had known had not vanished, but now stood as pillars for something better, something lasting. Justice, she realized, was not an endpoint, but a passage. Not a single victory, but an invitation for others to rise. As the hours passed, word of her decision spread through news bulletins, radio flashes, and community networks. Some debated, some questioned, but many celebrated. In the South End that evening, Janice heard distant song drifting over backyards, a chorus of voices gathering like evening sunbeams. Hope felt present, even fragile, but never more real. Janice returned home that night in silence, her windows reflecting the city's uncertain, beautiful promise. In the quiet darkness, she allowed herself a single, private smile. The journey through indignity and isolation had become, at last, a passage to belonging, not only for herself, but for every person who had ever wondered if justice could be made whole again.